We're here on a wonderfully sunny autumnal morning at the Avenue by Hatch in Peterborough, and I would like to welcome Dr. Jackie Lee to the Insight for Business podcast show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, I've only known you for a short period of time, Jackie, having attended the Food Industry Sustainability Programme, run in partnership with the STFC Food Network and IntelliDigest, where you ran a workshop over 2 days, looking firstly at life cycle thinking and supply chains for sustainable food production, followed up on day 2, looking at the tools to make this happen. And having mentioned 2 wonderful organisations based here in the UK, and would ask the listeners and viewers of the show to take just 5 or 10 minutes over a mini break to learn some more and look them up online. IntelliDigest combine innovative research with advanced engineering to solve global food sustainability challenges, and their vision is a world where no child goes to bed hungry. I'm very lucky to have had some one-to-one support from Dr. Ifeanyi Kanu, their CEO, as I look to further my knowledge and improve my organisation to support their outlook. The STFC Food Network is part of the Science and Technology Facilities Council. This is a government agency who carry out research in science and engineering and funds UK research in areas including particle physics, nuclear physics, space science and astronomy. Having spent time learning from their members on one of the workshops, it is simply amazing to see how their cutting-edge science is supporting the work to make food production sustainable, an effort that requires truly global collaboration and effort. So, your workshop really opened my eyes to the work which needs to be undertaken by industry, which is by no way insurmountable, and hopefully after COP26 we'll see a greater impetus to start such important work. But where do you see the greatest impetus coming from, Jackie?
I think now it has to come from industry. Industry is at the front edge of this. It's up to them, the decisions they make as to how their activities are undertaken. And whilst we need guidance and leadership from the political classes, ultimately it's business decisions and business actors that will make the difference on this. So I was clear and happy to see that at COP26 it was indeed the industry who were saying, come on, we need to do this. Come on, government, make the agreements. We want to go net zero. We want to make the difference. We want to make the changes to our business. We need some clear guidance from you so we know the playing field that we're working on. But it's definitely now, I think, an industry leading activity. And certainly for the big players and indeed smaller and smaller companies as the word spreads through supply chains, as they say.
Yeah. So that's as I see as well. As the larger industry pushes this forward, there will need to be some support for those smaller organisations as well as we move forward.
Absolutely.
So you have a degree in mechanical engineering and materials from 1992, and you also hold a PhD in environmental systems analysis from Cranfield in 1996. How have you seen the landscape change from those early days of your career in the areas of engineering and environmental systems?
Hugely. There really is no comparison. When I started in engineering and my first role was at Rolls-Royce, environment didn't really exist in the sense that we understand it now. We had HS&E and environment was very much on the health and safety,
Really?
Very, very small focus, very narrow thinking. And it was what was needed at the time. That was perfectly acceptable, but it didn't have that wider viewpoint, that wider understanding. When I went back to Rolls-Royce in 1998, I was working very fortunately in the Strategic Research Centre. And that allowed me to bring in some of the wider life cycle thinking that I'd developed, my understanding, my knowledge through my PhD, into a big company. And they were great and they were accepting that this was a new way of thinking. But that was still, nearly 15 years ago. And again, when I took the knowledge that I had out from the company to the wider aerospace, it was met with, yeah, that's really nice, but what's it got to do with us type attitude. Now, it's only been in the last, I would say, 10 years and 10 to 5 years, we've really seen industry step up to the plate on this and start to address some of those really big issues. And now sustainability is commonplace. Everybody talks about sustainability. Everybody talks about the circular economy. I'm not convinced everybody knows what they mean by that, but everybody talks about it, and most people have now heard of it. And most people would now not say climate change. They go, what's that? They would actually go, yes, climate change. They may or may not agree with its causes. They may or may not agree with how we deal with it. But at least it is now in the public and the business sphere of understanding and sphere of awareness, which it never was when I first started. So a lot has changed in the 30 odd years that I've been playing around in this field.
Playing around.
Absolutely playing around.
But you do, yeah. 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, you've seen that shift just in the last decade.
Big change.
And as you said, broadening and widening the scope of understanding for the average person in the street. That's part of it, isn't it?
I think it's part of it. There are two sides to this. You have the public who need to put pressure on their, if you like, their suppliers, the people they buy from, to say, well, I'm not going to buy my product from anymore because I don't like the way that you're doing things. And that's always been a very slow, very niche market, and will always continue to be, because not everybody has the luxury of being able to make some of those decisions. On the other side, you have the big business, for whom this might well be a strategic business decision. How can we make a difference between us and our competitors? How can we be leaders in the field? Some businesses like to be leaders, some like to be followers. And then, of course, you have the political playing field, where you have governments, national governments, international committees, etc., coming together, hopefully, to recognise that this is actually a global problem. And this is one of the first interesting things about climate change, is it's only the second really major global problem we've had to deal with. We had the hole in the ozone layer, and we came together for that for the Montreal Protocol. But this is only the second real problem we've had that's actually global in nature. Most other environmental issues can be relatively local. So there's never been a need for this level of collaboration and agreement. And so it's a new playing field, it's a new way of working, and people are not necessarily used to that and don't particularly feel comfortable in that type of arena.
At Insight for Business, we work with companies to look at their operational systems and processes and to streamline them by removing waste and increasing efficiency to make them more profitable. Is this part of the design freedom function when considering design for environment or even design for sustainability?
It is. If you think about what you can do with a product, you are constrained by levels of what we call design freedom. At the lowest levels, you can become more efficient. You can change products and processes to use less energy, use less materials. You might change the design slightly to change materials away from one that you know potentially has a worse environmental impact. As you go through the levels of design freedom, the bigger changes you want to make, the more freedom you need, the more time you need, the more resources you need, the more inventiveness that you need. Because actually, to make a big system change, it's not just what you're doing, it's what everybody around you is doing, who you interact with as well. They may be constraining you, that in the short term means you cannot change things. But in long term, in relationship building, you can work together to make bigger changes. And that's where that design freedom comes in. But certainly, the starting place is always what's happening in an area that I can influence. Here and now, that's going to be cost effective, that's going to deliver benefits to the community, to my business, and to the environment, hopefully, as well.
But moving forward from that, it requires the wider viewpoint of understanding supply chains, wider stakeholders, the wider task environment.
Absolutely. Moving forward, you need this life cycle perspective, this systems thinking. If you focus purely on making your little bit of that supply chain better, you run the risk of what we call burden shifting, where your bit gets better, but you've simply outsourced the impacts to somebody else, up or down your supply chain. And you cannot avoid that unless you take this systems life cycle approach.
Absolutely, and that came out of the workshop. It was eye-opening. As soon as it was there in front of me, it made perfect sense. But
it's one of those common sense light bulb moments. It makes sense when you know it and you think, well, why doesn't everybody see that? But until it's made absolutely clear, it can be sometimes difficult to understand.
And that makes me consider what role in an operation is it. We have there's the leadership tiers, but is there a role that should be looking at this perhaps?
Ideally, I would say yes, but it's never going to happen that way. So for me, life cycle thinking is a strategic
Patterns, yeah, strategic.
The guys who make the big decisions on where is the business going, what should we be making, and actually more importantly, what shouldn't we be making, because that question is very rarely asked. They need to be able to look and say, what are the strategic relationships we need to foster in order to ensure that our product meets the needs of community, the business, and the wider environment. And that sometimes doesn't happen. But it's not to say that those people down and on the shop floor and actually further down the tiers of management shouldn't also be thinking about this. These guys actually are the ones who have the knowledge about how the product is made, the issues on how it's manufactured. And unless that information gets fed up to the strategic level, you lose a lot of that. Actually, this is a small, easy win that we could take. So we need to look at this as well. You need them both, and they need to meet in the middle.
Top-down approach, again, involving everybody within an organisation, because these
Absolutely.
are the internal stakeholders. Yeah, that makes good sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've touched upon a little bit of your early career. Could you tell us where your own interest in sustainability started? Is there a root there, that a seed that grew?
Yeah, I mean, it was a sea change moment. I remember I was watching the television coverage of the Exxon Valdez disaster and seeing the pictures of the seabirds being dragged out, absolutely covered in oil, and the sheer number, the sheer volume. And it made me realise that, and I remember sitting there with tears streaming, thinking, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. At the time, I was in the middle of an engineering degree. Engineering was, the hard topics like thermodynamics and electronics and mechanicals, materials and all this kind of stuff. And there wasn't anything in there about earth sciences, about the environment that we actually needed in order to make all these wonderful things as engineers. And I still believe that engineers are fundamental to the solution to this, because we make solutions. And so if engineers are trained correctly, we can make really good solutions. But in order to train engineers correctly, we needed to get engineers to understand the natural world, because we were utilising the world as a free resource, and it's not. So I went back to university. I was lucky enough to be doing a 5-year master's course that allowed me to take some courses from other departments. So I immediately went off to the geography department and said, I want to take some courses in natural science.
Wow.
Will they fit in? They said, yes, you can do this. Loved them. Absolutely thought they were fantastic, really opened my eyes. And that started me on the journey. When I finished my degree, I didn't know what I wanted to do, still wasn't really sure I wanted to go. I knew I didn't want to go back to Rolls-Royce and work at Rolls-Royce. I've been there twice, so this was the first time. I knew I didn't want to go back there. So where was I going to go? And somebody said, do a PhD. And it had never occurred to me before then to do a PhD. Again, I was incredibly fortunate. I basically wrote down what I thought I would like to do for my PhD, sent it off to a university. They said, this sounds great, come along and do it. Now, I recognise that that's actually very rare. It doesn't happen very often that way. So I was very lucky to be able to go off and do my PhD in environmental systems assessment. And I worked on something which 20 years ago was, at the beginnings of its birth, if you like. It was a topic that we kind of knew a little bit about, but didn't know much about. It grew into what is now known as life cycle assessment. But at the time, it was very new. People really didn't have data. And I also approached it from a way that, again, has come back into fashion through the circular economy, which is what we call, I suppose, it's the integrated system. I wasn't only interested in looking at engineering systems on its own. I wanted to see what happened when you looked at the whole integrated system. So my environmental systems assessment looked at a manufacturing process, a farm, and a housing estate. And I wanted to understand the links between them. So where did the farm wastes go? What happened to them? Where did the outputs from the house, what did they need? Where did they get them from? How was the energy produced? So a fully integrated system, utilising a very rudimentary life cycle assessment type process in a graphical form, because I thought, well, I might as well do everything together, make it nice and easy. Engineers like pictures, so let's put it into a picture form. And it's only been in the last, I suppose, 5 to 10 years, I've actually realised that what I was actually trying to do was create a circular system. but I didn't know it as such then. I'm kicking myself now, obviously, because if I'd written the book in 1996 when I did my PhD, I would now be more famous than Ellen MacArthur.
Yes.
But I didn't do anything about it. For me, it was my PhD, it was done. But it was the start of understanding for me that I cannot look at engineering as a single point. You have to look at it in the wider sense of everything else that goes on around it. So my point of where I am now is I spend 90% of my time at a technology-human interface, because that is where we have the issues. And that's where I find the most interesting systems approaches and how you have to resolve the human interaction if you want a system and a solution to work.
It does sound to me, having learned that, it seemed you were the right person at the right time to come out of that engineering with the engineering background, that analytical approach, and to have found the interest, that sea change moment.
Yeah.
And then to take action and do something about it, to be asked, what about a PhD? It does sound like it came together and it was...
It did.
The stars aligning.
It was, and I think at the time you don't see it, but obviously looking back on it, then it clearly was, because it has given me a very unique perspective in that I don't follow an engineer, I don't follow social science, I don't follow economics. I sit absolutely in the middle, because for me that's what it's all about. You can't have a solution which is focused entirely on people, because it won't work technically and it won't work economically. You can't go to economics because you'll lack of the environment and it won't necessarily deliver to people.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to sit in that place.
A unique vantage point.
And look in all directions. And because I've also worked in industry and worked in academia, I also sit in a very lucky place in that I am interested in the latest thinking, but I also recognise that you can't put the latest thinking into industry because it's too far forward. So you have to translate the latest thinking into language and tools that industry can actually apply if you want industry to move down this road. And that's where I find interesting. You talk to industry and find out what they need. You take the latest thinking from academic blue skies and you make a solution that fits in the middle, that encourages businesses to take that next step. But it also means that academics can see that their work is being applied, that actually they're not just thinking of in their ivory towers, and that they can see there are benefits in some of the work that they're doing because they can see what comes out at the end of it. They can see it makes a change.
Very well summarised, thank you. So, can you explain a little about the work undertaken to gain your PhD and help our listeners and viewers to gain an appreciation of what environmental systems analysis is? And perhaps how they could start to understand the environmental systems around them at home or work, perhaps?
Yes, it comes down to what we've mentioned before, life cycle thinking, and looking at more than just what's immediately in front of you and thinking a little bit about what happened before it got to you. So looking at a cup of coffee, for example. So not only do you have to look up your supply chain, you also have to look down. So what happens when you finished? What do you do with your coffee grounds? Do you chuck them in the bin? What do you do with your waste jars? Do they go in for recycling? How, for example, are you, if you are lucky enough to have a compost heap, what are you actually doing with the compost? Where is it going? Are you using it? Or if you do what I do, which is keep putting things on the compost heap until you have a massive mound and do nothing with it, because I'd never get around to digging in the garden.
That is what's happening in our garden as well.
Yes, it's a very common thing.
But I did, on that point, I did think recently, what am I going to do with this 100 odd gallon compost heap? Surely there is somebody I can give it to help.
Yes. There's always, but you have to think about it, and it has to become an active process. And I think that's part of this life cycle thinking. It's an active process. You're not just accepting things and saying this is what it is. You're actually starting to think. And awareness is 90% of the problem. If you are become aware of what's happening and aware of the impact that you are creating, you are far more likely to make conscious choices to do something different. And that might mean, first of all, that you have to spend a bit of time going off and finding out information. And you may spend a lot of time not actually doing anything, but just getting information. And then when you have the information, then you can start making behavioural changes. But you can't do anything unless you know, and you can't know anything until you become aware of things.
How do businesses start to engineer sustainability into their products. Where should they start? And firstly, is there a good reason to do this?
It's legislation.
Yeah.
There are bits of legislation say you can't use particular materials, therefore they have to change their product, their process to avoid those materials. Sometimes it becomes a driver from a particularly strong-willed member of the strategic board. The MD might have set up his business focused on environment, and so everything is focused through environment sustainability. And so that is simply then just the way that the business
It can
works.
come out of the leadership and the governance that's set up, yeah.
It can even occasionally come out of the workers, if the workers
Really?
have a strong enough voice
Wow.
and the management is prepared to listen. So it's not unheard of, and it can come that way. And it can also come from what we call a mandate to operate by the company's customers. If the company find they're losing business and they do a focus group and they find they're losing business because customers don't like the way they're doing something or don't like the product in some way, that's one of the quickest ways that the company will then change its stance, because the company wants to remain in business. So if it finds it's losing customers through this mandate to operate, it can change its route to doing that. So whether or not it's a desire to behave in a good corporate citizen way, or whether or not it's a requirement from legal needs or government policies or legislation, or even just that they feel that they could get a better customer base, it doesn't really matter what the driver is, so long as they start.
Yeah.
As to where they start, we touched on this earlier. They start with the low-hanging fruit, the things that are easy to do. Now, no company is obviously inefficient, because that would mean that they were not making as much profit as they could do. So companies are generally pretty efficient. But what they're not necessarily good at is having that slightly wider perspective, which makes them see beyond their gate-to-gate operations. And that can sometimes open up opportunities that they weren't aware of before. So looking up their supply chain and down their supply chain could say, actually, if we partnered with this supplier, we could come up with a better input to our product. Or if we partnered with this waste disposal company, we could get our products back, or we could get something back that would be good, because that would be a raw material input for us. So that wider thinking, that wider awareness can open up opportunities. And yes, the initial actions are going to be small. They're not going to be a complete revamp and overhaul of the company ethos or product portfolio. But it's the starting point for thinking, and as I said earlier, what do we make, but more importantly, what shouldn't we make?
What shouldn't we make? Yeah.
Or what shouldn't we do?
Taking some action, starting, gives you a basis to build from.
Absolutely. And the first couple of years, it's going to be little things. It's going to be efficiency measures, but it's going to be learning about your product in more detail and learning about that wider value chain.
Creating a dialogue within the organisation, potentially as I would hope, looking at your supply chain, having a dialogue with your suppliers, having a dialogue internally in the operation, having a dialogue with your customers.
Yeah. And it's not just the people that you sell to. It's the people that might actually interact with your product after your product is finished being used by your consumers. The energy material inputs are greater for the circular economy than they are for the virgin system. So I look on circular economy as an application of appropriate lifetimes and fitting deaths, whereby you recycle when and where it is appropriate to do so, and you don't when it isn't. And there are many, many activities we have which are dispersive, which means that actually collecting everything back together to enable it to be recovered, recycled, reused in some way are so expensive and so difficult that actually it doesn't make any sense to do that. And it also means that you need to think about when and where you use more durable materials. If you are going to use something that is only going to be used for 5 years, you don't make it out of materials that will last 100 years. If you're going to make something that you want to last 25 years, you don't make it out of plastic that's only going to last 3. So utilising the right materials for the right lifetime and ensuring that you can do something appropriate with it at end of life is what makes a sustainable system. And sometimes that will be recycling and sometimes it won't. But you only get to understand that when you look at that full life cycle systems picture.
And that's about engineering in sustainability, as we touched on earlier.
Engineering and sustainability.
I know of, I believe, we make mobile phones, smartphones,
Yep.
that have this incredibly short lifespan because, in context,
Yes.
because phone companies want to keep making phones and selling phones. We could make something more longer lived,
You could.
but that
But that would go against the business model.
would go against the business model. Again, that comes down to the business and the leadership.
But it also comes down to their markets. Consumers liked having new phones every 3 years.
Or were
Because
they
they
told they
new
had to have?
features.
Yeah.
Okay, so there are generations of people who will always get a new phone when it comes out because of the new gadgets and
Yes.
gizmos. Now, if you think about people's attitudes and behaviours, go back to after the war. Everybody was, make, do, and mend. Things
Yes.
had been in scarce and short supply, so everybody made use of everything as best they could for as long as they could. We then shifted into behaviours which is a consumer society where we use things for as little, that we get rid of them, they break, we throw them away, we don't mend them, and we go and buy another one. I think we're beginning to find that society's values are changing again, and we're now starting to move back to wanting things that last longer. And so the business model of a new phone every 3 years may not actually still be around in the next 10 years because people might have decided that actually they don't want their phone to be changed every 3 years because they want to have something they feel is better for the environment, it lasts longer. So businesses respond to what their customers want. If customers' values change, the business mandate changes and they will start to produce things that the customer wants, i.e. phones that may last longer.
Yeah, let's hope.
But that's the difference. It's about customers having a power to say something. And when it becomes a large enough customer base, businesses will take notice.
Thank you. After the workshop, I now have a favourite grey area, which is the answer, it depends.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It definitely gets the grey matter working. Can you explain how this relates to understanding sustainability within organisations?
Yes. The answer, it depends, is a standard answer for any question to do with environment. So what should I do? Well, it depends. And it all depends on context. So for businesses understanding sustainability, you need to know your operating environment. You need to know where you are, when you are, who you are. Because in a different country or at a different time or in a different part of the country, your best environmental solution may look completely different. So this idea that one size fits all is unfortunately a fallacy.
It's a fallacy.
And it doesn't work. I mean, you can apply it to a certain level, but after, when your area starts to get too big or you're changing the culture too much, the solution won't be the same. And so being cognizant and being aware of what you are trying to do, where you are trying to do it, will give you an answer to what is sustainability for you at this time. Another thing I would say is that once you've defined in the business what your sustainability is, it isn't going to stay the same. So you're going to need to go back and review it. Not every year, but every 5 years maybe. Go back, have a look. Is sustainability still what we think it is? All the things we've done in the past 5 years, how has that changed things? What is our next goal going to be? Sustainability is not a destination, it's a journey. And you're never going to get there. You're never going to be entirely sustainable because the surrounding environment to you is also going to be changing. So you may well be sustainable at a time, but if things around you change, then actually you'll need to change with it. We can see this, and perhaps the biggest example is through climate change. We're starting to see the fires, the droughts, the floods. How you operate in that kind of business changes almost on a yearly basis now. And so the answer, it depends, is unfortunately the right answer. But again, I keep coming back to this. It depends because you have to look wider than your own system.
Again, this topic that's running through is understanding the breadth of the arena in which you operate, understanding those wider stakeholders and the task environment in which you operate, the systems thinking approach.
Systems thinking, it all comes down to systems thinking, the life cycle perspective. And that makes you look at things in an entirely different way. And I'm not suggesting that businesses have to become amazing organisations that have perfect sight along their value chain, because that is unrealistic. But I do think an awareness outside their own gates is the good starting point for this.
That's a great point you make about sustainability being a journey. I consider myself a lifelong learner. Learning is a continual journey through life. I lean on continuous improvement, lifelong journey. Sustainability also makes perfect sense as a lifelong journey.
It is. It's not. Businesses started to ask the question, how can I be sustainable? And I often think, well, you can be more sustainable, but I don't think you can ever be truly sustainable because circumstances change around you. So you have to be fleet of foot. You have to be prepared to change, to manoeuvre. And of course, this is where actually sustainability benefits the smaller company because they can move faster. Bigger companies are usually quite set. And whilst they have resources and knowledge, which benefits them in the journey to sustainability, they sometimes find it quite hard to move, and it takes a long time. They're a bit like the oil tanker; it takes them 3 miles or so to stop and turn around. Whereas a small,
so the dynamic smaller company can
move much faster.
Can move more quick.
Yeah, can move much faster on this.
Lots of businesses understand the importance of data, but how you measure is as important as what you measure. And could you give some examples to illustrate this concept, please? Yeah,
there are lots of people out there who will tell you the data that you need to gather to understand your impact on sustainability. You need to understand your energy data, your materials inputs, your materials outflow, your waste, etc. And there are lots of standards that tell you this as well. And these standards are very useful for guiding businesses into understanding what information will help them to make better sustainability decisions. What some of the standards don't do, however, is tell them how they need to measure this. And there is a good reason for this, is that every business organises their activities in different ways. And it also depends if you are a new manufacturing facility or an old manufacturing facility. That will depend on how easily you can separate out your energy consumption to buildings or to particular product streams. So older businesses generally have electricity measured to a building. In that building, they may have 3 or 4 product streams running through. So it's very hard for them to separate out how much energy is being used specifically to make one product. Newer facilities may actually have individual product stream measurements because they were set up that way, they were built that way. So you have a choice generally of 2 ways of measuring. You can either do what we do bottom up, which is where we stick machines or measuring machines on individual parts of the process and then add them all together. Or you can do top-down measurement, where you have an aggregated value that comes in at a factory level, and then you make assumptions. You will allocate it according to the number of parts made or economic value or some way of allocating it down to a particular product. If you take those 2 for the same product in the same factory and measured one top-down and one bottom-up, I can guarantee the answer would not be the same. And that's partly because there are centralised systems that come in and sometimes are measured and sometimes aren't measured. But that difference can be quite significant. Yes. And so when you measure, what you need to do is to say, okay, we are always going to measure in the same way. We know that the value we're going to get out is not necessarily the right number, but it will be comparable with anything else we measure in the same way. So we'll be able to see if we are improving because our number will have dropped. Not that the number itself is actually right, but the number will have dropped. If you start measuring some things as bottom up and some things as top down, it becomes very, very hard to compare. Yeah, now, it's fine if you do it consistently the same way, but actually you get some companies who measure in all sorts of different ways and they keep changing the way that they measure things. I'm not saying you shouldn't change, because if you get a better way of measuring things, then that's fine. But you do need to be aware that actually the how you measure is actually as important as what you measure. Because if you don't get that right and you're not consistent, you'll never have any way of making sure that you're actually moving down that journey. That you might actually simply be measuring differences in the measurement techniques, not actually differences in what you've done.
That is a worry, of course. And even within sectors,
yeah,
I have a history in flexible packaging, 20 plus years. That's a sector that I normally think of within manufacturing terms. And yeah, companies could be using top-down, bottom-up approaches where again, I just want to standardise and tell the industry, this is how you are best doing it, almost.
But you
But-
can't.
but
You
I
can't-
can't-
you
but I
can't
can.
do that.
But to be consistent allows you to be comparable between
Yes.
the different
Yeah.
sets of
It's
data.
consistency. And there are other things that you need to think about. When we spoke on the training course about life cycle assessment and data gaps. And when you're trying to understand the environmental impact of a product, you will look at all the inputs to and all the outputs from a particular system. If you have lots of information about one little part of that process and not much information about the rest of it, when the results come out, it'll look like that little part is actually worse than anything else. It's not, it's just simply that you've got more information. So being aware of data gaps and being aware of what we call the granularity of the data also helps you to understand what comes out the back end. There's a very good adage in engineering, which is garbage in equals garbage out. And that's true of all measurement systems. But it's not just the quality of the data, it's the data gaps as well that you need to be aware of and how that might skew your readings of the results. So there's a lot of science involved in reading the information that comes out of all this data that we're now all quite happily gathering, that we all have big data and big data analysis, but actually understanding what you're seeing is a really important part of that, and being able to sometimes pick out what's noise in the data and what is actually a true issue that you need to be looking at.
It's certainly a specialist role to be able to manage the data from the whys and wherefores of, and then making a sense of it and using it in the wider system.
Yeah.
There is a lot to it.
Yeah.
Last couple of questions. In your view, what is the key to tackling big picture issues such as sustainability? We may have touched on some of the themes before, and I don't mind reviewing those.
The key is communication, open-mindedness and systems. For me, if you cannot see beyond your own little bit, and I'm not saying that you need to be an expert in everything, but you need to see where your bit fits into the big picture. And you need to be able to understand who do you need to make relationships with. If you have a product that has a particularly expensive component or particularly expensive material, you need to make a key relationship with the people at the end of life because you would like that back. That has value to you. But unless you realise that, then you're never going to make that link. You're never going to pick the systems up, and you're never then going to work as a team to get a better solution overall. So for me, it's about communication, the systems thinking, and being open to ideas and open to other relationships.
That's fantastically succinct. It does wrap it up and pull it together. And it, I hope, also leads nicely into my final question. Given that I'd like to finish on a leadership theme, which I've not focused on within the podcast shows as yet, but I'd like to introduce this area. So maybe I could ask, in your experience, what do you see as a key factor or factors in successful leadership when managing and developing teams or projects? Maybe, especially given the context of sustainability, it's something new to be considered within organisations.
Okay. So this very much, I think, depends on the type of leader that people are. And for me, I am somebody who appreciates inventiveness. Sustainability is a difficult, complex issue. We're going to have to be inventive if you want to solve it. So as a leader, I would like to see, I encourage inventiveness in the team. I encourage that trial and error on the understanding that if it all goes wrong, the buck stops with me. So I take responsibility if something goes wrong, but I also encourage the team to be creative and try these new things. I think you cannot do that unless you're open with your team, and you cannot do that unless you have good communication. And I don't think that any team works well unless they trust their leader to make the best decisions that they can on the basis of the information they have. So you have to have trust, openness, communication and inventiveness for me.
Absolutely. Fantastic way to wrap up the podcast show. Thank you so much for
Thank you very much.
being our guest today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.